Coming up on this special politics edition of District Wire News, as the presidential candidates prepare to go head-to-head, we'll take a look at both of the upcoming debates for the Democrats and Republicans.
And young voters, how will the millennial vote affect the 2016 election? Young Democrats and Republicans weigh in. District Wire News starts right now.
Good afternoon, I'm Trey Yingst.
And I'm Jeff Martin. And we begin with news out of Amman, Jordan. 2 Americans and 1 South African contractor were killed this morning when a Jordanian police officer opened fire at a Special Forces training compound south of the city. The gunman was shot and killed by security forces while trying to escape. Sources in Amman tell us that the officer had recently been fired from his job, but it's unknown whether or not that was the reasoning for the shooting. And in a previously scheduled appearance this morning, President Obama stated that the U.S. would be working closely with the Jordanians to determine the cause of the shooting.
Obviously, a full investigation is taking place. We take this very seriously, and we'll be working closely with the Jordanians to determine exactly what happened.
This comes in the wake of President Obama's recent announcement that the United States will be operating special operations forces in Syria. Those troops will most likely be based in Jordan. And in other news today, we have an update on the investigation into the crash of a Russian airliner in Egypt last weekend. U.S. and Israeli intelligence points to a bomb placed on board by members of the Islamic State, but crash investigators are pushing for caution, stating that it's far too early to tell the cause of the crash. And with these incidents in the news, one issue going forward is the 2016 presidential candidates' views on foreign policy. Joining us in the studio now with more is White House political analyst J.C. Bua, who's being interviewed by District Wire News' chief foreign correspondent, Trey Yingst. Trey?
Thanks, Jeff. I'm here with White House political analyst Jean-Christopher Bua, also a commentator at News to Share. J.C., I'd like to thank you for joining us today.
What a wonderful operation you have here. Such very talented people, and happy to be sharing news with you.
Well, thank you. Today we're really going to talk about how foreign policy and foreign policy decisions are playing into the 2016 elections. So I want to start from the top. We've seen this news out of the Sinai Peninsula, Russian plane crash. The Russians are now in Syria, back in the Assad regime. What are your thoughts on all of this and where we're headed?
Well, in a little more than 24 hours, the Republicans will be debating from Milwaukee. And I think we'll see if any of this resonates with the candidates. It may not. They're still in their stages of figuring out who they are and how they can appeal to their audience and bring more money into their campaigns. But foreign policy is a very interesting aspect this year, and I don't know how far it will resonate. We hope it does, because let's face it, Trey, these candidates better know what they're getting themselves into. If they want to be president of the United States, they have to know how to deal with Mr. Assad, Mr. Putin, problems like the Sinai bombing, which we now know is definitively a bombing, and the annexation of Crimea, and all that's going on in the Middle East. The president today was with Mr. Netanyahu at the White House, and the iceberg there in the Oval Office started to melt a little bit, but there still is problems, and we don't know where the candidates really stand on these issues, which, between you and me and everyone else, this is our future.
Sure. What have you been seeing, particularly from the briefing room when you were there last week? What is the press secretary saying about these things? And I know that he's staying up to date on these elections, particularly for Democrats, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Do you think that Josh Earnest believes that the president believes they have the capability to take over as a Democrat in the White House?
Well, I think the president, needless to say, has many hats. In fact, he wears 5 hats. He's the chief policy advisor, let's face it. He is the chief diplomat. He's basically the Secretary of State on steroids. He is the commander-in-chief, okay? And don't forget, he is the head of his party. And he has to get his party to win. That's what he wants to do, continue the Democratic Party legacy, to continue his legacy, and to make sure that the things that he put in place in his 8 years will continue for the future.
So out of the Democratic candidates, the 2 frontrunners, we have Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Who do you believe can take that step and continue on his legacy to combat all of these issues that are happening internationally?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's kind of split up. In some ways it would be Bernie Sanders, in some ways it would be Hillary, and they're going to have to fight it out, because it is about 14 months left. Actually, it's not. It's less than a year till the election, and it's a little more to when that particular next president puts his or her hand on the Bible and swears in.
We look over at the Republican side, and we have the two frontrunners, Donald Trump and Ben Carson. In terms of foreign policy, do you believe that maybe the Republican approach to dealing with the Assad regime, dealing with Putin, is maybe too strong-armed?
I have no idea what it is, to be very honest with you and with your viewers. Donald Trump says he wants to blow them up. He's going to blow up all the oil fields. And Ben Carson, I'm not quite sure what he has to say these days. He's trying to get away from the fact that he was not offered a scholarship to West Point, so Trump's going to have to stick him with that a little bit tomorrow night.
Certainly. So kind of shifting more into the Islamic State, we look at Iraq, we look at Syria, and these candidates, like you said, are going to have a lot on their plate. Whoever ends up winning the election in November of 2016 is going to have a lot to deal with. What do you think is the most important issue when it comes to this international conflict that they need to be aware of?
They need to be aware of that ISIL has now metastasized. It's now in Egypt. It was a smaller organization. It was competitive with Al-Qaeda. It has now moved ahead of Al-Qaeda. And the things that should be concerning to the American people, if they are paying attention, which we hope they are, is the fact that the lone wolves, the affiliate groups with ISIL, can do a lot of damage. And the fact that they can get into airplanes at a major airport and cause so much damage, and cause so much damage economically. The fact that Prime Minister Cameron had to come out and say, yes, it was a bomb, I believe, and we're going to stop flights between Sharm el-Sheikh and the various airports in England and the UK, shows that he is struggling with the economic concerns that his country has, that this kind of terrorism is wreaking havoc upon Europe and eventually upon the United States.
So you talk about the economic crisis, and we look into Europe, the refugee crisis that's happening right now. How are these candidates going to offer support representing the United States for an issue that really seems to be getting completely out of hand?
To be very honest with you, that's up to us. That's up to the American people. That's up to your viewers. That's up to the millennials who are part of your generation that need to hold the administration, the government, and the media's feet to the fire and demand answers for those questions that will be crucial to them in the next few years. And I think millennials do hold the key to the next election if they are motivated and they get out to vote.
Certainly. So we look at the debates. Are the candidates focusing, in your opinion, on the issues that they need to be focusing on? We don't necessarily see as much when it comes to a discussion of the refugee crisis, for example.
Well, the refugee crisis, and I brought it up at the briefing last week, it is plaguing Europe right now. Prime Minister, Chancellor Merkel is having difficulties. She's having difficulties with her neighbors. Some of them say, why aren't you letting refugees in? Why aren't you giving them status? Why aren't you taking care of them and supporting them? Don't leave them in Serbia. Don't leave them on the borders of Hungary. And it's causing internal European problems. And anything that happens in Europe, because we're now in a global borderless economy with our finance systems, with our banking system, with our economic systems, that if we don't get a grip on it, and the American people and the administration, which I believe they are trying to, through Treasury, et cetera, get a grip on the EU crisis with basically 1 million refugees and migrants flooding into Europe, then we are going to suffer a world crisis. So you have the world crisis because of the escape and the people leaving from Syria because of ISIL, and then you have the actual impact of what ISIL can do and Al-Qaeda can do in Europe, and eventually, unfortunately, if we're not careful and we're not diligent, in the United States of America.
And wrapping up here with one last question, I know you had spoken about this very extensively at the White House at these press briefings. We have lone wolf terrorists now that we have to worry about. On a political platform, it's something that it seems like candidates would want to speak about how they're going to combat this issue because it's something that people are concerned about. What advice would you give to candidates that are running for the 2016 nomination to ultimately be president of the United States on how they should make the American people feel safe?
I think they need to take a stand, and I think that it should be more than just smoke, and it should be more than hot air. There's a lot of that going on. I think it should be a profound and sound, dynamic idea of what they can do either on the borders or with airlines coming in from other states, the satellite countries like Germany, through Frankfurt, through Schiphol in Holland, through Great Britain, through France. That's where they're coming through, and by the time they get to the United States, it could be too late.
Sure.
So it's time to be diligent is my point. It's time for all of us to be diligent.
Sure. I want to thank you again for joining us. John Christopher Bua, White House political analyst and News to Share commentator.
Pleasure.
Coming up on District Wire News, the next Republican debate is a little over 24 hours away. What can we expect from Donald Trump and Ben Carson now that Carson is leading the pack? We've got experts here in the studio to weigh in, plus the youth vote. We'll talk with 2 millennials and get their take on the election and candidates. More when District Wire News returns.